Afternoon, everybody. Delighted to welcome you here to our Dazzling Debuts. So these are the three people here who are going to dazzle you with their three novels: The Deadwood Encore, Run with the Hare, Hun with the Hound, and The Amusements. So I'll just introduce the three in the order that they're going to appear, but I'll get the introductions over with now. So in the centre here we have Kathleen Murray. So Kathleen was born in Carlow and educated at Trinity College Dublin. She's published work in The Stinging Fly, Dublin Review, Winter Papers, and various anthologies. In 2007, she was the first Irish winner of the Fish Short Story Prize, and she was a finalist for the Davy Byrnes Short Story Award for her story Storm Glass. And The Deadwood Encore, I should say, is her first novel. So we'll be hearing from Kathleen first up. Paul Duffy here is an archaeologist and historian and has published widely on these subjects. His short fiction has also been published, broadcast, and shortlisted for many national and international competitions. Paul's debut novel, Run with the Hare, Hun with the Hound, brings together strands of his writing to create an immersive narrative set in 12th century Ireland. And Aingeala Flannery was born in Waterford. She's an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, and writer. Aingeala was awarded a literature bursary by the Arts Council in both 2020 and 2021. Her debut novel, The Amusements, is published by Penguin Sandycove. She lives in Dublin and is working on her second novel. And this particular event is generously sponsored by the Open University of Ireland. So, just the order of events, we'll hear a short reading from each of the three, followed by one or two very short questions. Then I'll be talking to all three of them just about the whole process of getting your first novel on paper. How do you get it into print? What's your next plans? All those sort of general questions. And then hopefully we can open to the public at the end. So that's our plan. Let's hope it works. So can I ask Kathleen to come up and read an extract from The Deadwood Encore?
Hiya. I'm just going to start it from the start and just read a few pages. Okay. I need you. So. Tuesday afternoon, a good-looking young one with a scrawny whelp of a child arrives at our back door. Actually, I'm going to have to change my glasses. Sorry.
Sorry, can't hear very well.
Can you not hear? Yeah, sorry.
I'll read this.
Thanks. Can you hear this? Or yeah, great. Tuesday afternoon, a good-looking young one with a scrawny whelp of a child arrives at our back door. "Mrs. Whelan here?" she asks. "No," I says. The way she's staring at me, I think I might have a blob of chicken curry on my chin or something. So I rub the chin and my nose just in case, and the young fella starts copying me. "Is she due back?" she asks. "Yeah, well, it's impossible to tell with the mater. She travels to the beat of her own drum." It's for the cure. She stands there adjusting her bag. The strap stretches her top off her shoulder a bit, and you can see her collarbone. There's something very even about that bone. It's actually me you're looking for," I says. And then I feel the red starting up from my neck, the thought of maybe laying hands on her. Well, not on her, but a couple of inches over whatever affliction she has. The mother is more spirit guides, tea leaves and that. Oh, well, I must have picked it up wrong. We may as well give it a go, seeing as we're here. Is ringworm okay? Ringworm can be tricky enough at the best of times, and I'm still waiting for the best of times to arrive. They say by the time he was 5-year-old, my father had a full gift, and his father could drain the infection off a man with the whack of his left thumb by the age of 10. My great-grandfather didn't show any sign till his 16th birthday, and then he'd lift Lazarus from the grave. Well, if Lazarus' death had anything to do with circulatory issues, I mean. I was holding out hope for my 18th birthday, but that's come and gone nearly 2 years. And I'm only getting joy out of warts and the odd rash. It'd be easier if the dad was around just to give me a steer. Grand, I says, come on in. Where is it mostly? Because we do see a lot on the stomach. It's not on me, she says, giving me daggers. It's him. It's on his leg. Oh yeah, well, I could do warts while you're here, I says, trying to make up a bit of ground. Like, if the child has any. His hands? The young lad looks up doubtfully at his mother. Connor, show the man your hands. The boy rips his fingers through the air like a tiger. Knock it off, Connor. He straightens them out, giving me the middle finger first, then unfolding the others. Dirty fingernails, and there's some kind of hangnail situation going on with the thumb. There's no sign of a wart. Yeah, it does look all clear, though, well, they can be dormant. Dormant warts, she says, sounding interested. Oh yeah, I says, trying not to be too showy. It's actually kind of my thing. Well, at the moment, like, you do specialise in one area and then you expand out. Oh. Well, like, if it was joints, I'd be doing knees and shoulders. Hips. Oh, hips comes out too strong. Like, I'm thinking about hips. Or an ear, nose, throat fella. They're both staring at me. And my mind says, shut the fuck up. But my mouth says, well, you have to see what emerges. You know, what comes out over time. Like, every generation is different, so you never know. I mean, you probably heard of my dad, Billy Whelan. He was well known for digestive stuff and skin afflictions and general pain relief. A bit of everything, really. I mean, there's a lot looking for immune system stuff now, and that's a new field. Well, in a way, though there was always, you know, hay fever and stuff. Warts, she goes. Oh yeah, I says. All warts, she says. Oh yeah. Genital? What the fuck? She gives me the hairy eyeball. Language, please. And she nods at the young fella who's pulling a scab off his elbow. Well, that's not really my thing, I says. Well, she says, it's nobody's thing when you think of it. So, the ringworm cure? I direct her towards the sitting room, for our kitchen can be in any kind of state. She indicates an area at the back of the kid's knee. I put my hand out, I hover it, and I close my eyes. Usually I think of football scores or calculate the odds of something happening. But today I remember this one time when I asked the dad if there was special words inside his head when he was given the cure. He laughed, but didn't say what the real prayer was. He just started to sing. Something about touching a leaf or the sky or a baby crying. Finish it for me, Frank, he said. I'd heard him sing it 1,000,000 times. So I put my head back and I gave it some welly. I believe. There you have it, son. There you have it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Kathleen, obviously it's comic. How hard is it to write comic? I'm wondering. I know you're a short story writer, a very successful short story writer before, a novelist, but sustaining comedy or just catching the comic voice, it's fascinating, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Tell me if this is okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I suppose I didn't think of writing it as comic, but once the voice came, there was a lot of comedy in it, so I guess I was lucky because the voice kind of drove it, and it was a very distinctive voice. And I think for me, because I often say I'm kind of emotionally shallow, and I do use comedy to deal with emotionally difficult situations. So I actually have to work against comedy to kind of go back over the text and see if there's any emotional depth to it. So one of the edits I did was really going back over it and taking out, like, in a way, comedy is hard, but comedy is easy because you can have cheap shots. I suppose that's a good thing about a novel rather than Twitter or something a little bit faster, because you can go back and temper it with something that's a little bit maybe deeper. So when I write, often the very beginning, it's quite snappy and like that, and I actually have to dial it down a bit. And that's in my writing, I have to do that, possibly in my life, but certainly in my writing, I do have to do that. So yeah, the comedy was not the most difficult bit for me. Thanks, Dave.
And I suppose at one level is about a man's insecurity about himself. Like, is he a seventh son? He's one of of a pair of twins, and is he a seventh son? Because the gift doesn't seem to be coming to him, this seventh son of a seventh son gift. And it struck me, he's a little bit like, I don't know if this is where the name came, Frank Hardy in The Faith Healer has the same problem. You know, is my faith healing working? And I wonder, you called this guy Frank, is kind of interesting. But you kind of think it's going to go in a certain direction, where the twins born the other way around. But then there's this wonderful moment, this not much of a spoiler there, it happens quite early, where he's talking to his twin Bernie, and Bernie has decided that his gender is female. He's going to be a female, so you're actually a sixth son, not the seventh son. And you've all these sort of comic things. Am I right in saying it began as a short story that then expanded?
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I don't really plan or plot even when I'm writing. So I just sit down and I have lots of thoughts, but a lot of the time the thoughts I have are really the enemies of what I write, or they're not always friends to them. So I think about things a lot, and then when I write, something else happens, and I have to accept that my thoughts are not as important as actually sitting down on my backside in the seat and writing, because that's a bit different. And that did start off with, the story started off with two brothers in an A&E, and one was obviously in a bad way on a gurney in the A&E, and the other was being quite mean to him. And he had a lot of anger, and he had a strong voice, and he was narrating, and he was being kind of cruel to the brother. And I had no idea why. I had no idea really what their relationship was. I knew they were twins, but I didn't know what it was. And that's where I presumed it was going to be another short story, because up to that point, that's all I had done. But I wrote it, and it was a bit. If it was a short story, it was going to be a bit longer. And then I, bit through circumstances, was put in the way of writing a novel. And then I developed that, and other kind of elements come into it. But like for me, that's always the interesting thing, because it's like going to a party and meeting people, and then when you leave it, the next day somebody says, "Oh, but you know, he used to go out with her," or you know, she's his younger sister, and you think, "Oh, well, that makes sense now." I thought there was something there, but I didn't know what the dynamics were. I picked up on something. So it's very similar, like there's something going on, but I have no idea what it is, or why he's like this, and why he'd be angry. And usually it's very shallow at the start. It's like a caricature. The emotions are shallow, and the humour is quite shallow, and then I've got to go back and kind of go over it, and eventually things will emerge that make more sense in a deeper way. And that's the real gift of it, I suppose, the gift of writing a novel, having time to do that. Thanks.
Yeah, particularly between the first draft, second draft, or third draft. Like writing is discovery, isn't it? Yes. You don't know what you want to write, you discover as you write. There's another very interesting voice comes into this one, the voice of the father, and he's already dead, which is curious, but he's always coming in terms of songs, in terms of music, like Perry Como or Bing Crosby, all the old crooners and things like that. And an interesting choice is that his sections are in a different font. Was that your thought, or was that an editor's thought?
Yeah, I mean, he came in quite late. Like, I had quite a bit of it written, and I was just, after the end of a writing week, I just kind of tidied up my writing, and it was all in this one character's voice, this young fella, Frank, who's 19, and he's quite insecure, and he's quite an insecure person to be with, and I was with him most days of the week, until I was with real people. I was with him. And then suddenly one day, when I had was tidying up, I went to write, and this other voice came through, which was the father who's dead. So obviously I didn't expect that he was going to have a voice in the story, and he came back into it, and the first part of writing him was, he was saying, "I don't know why I'm here, and I don't know how I got here, and as far as I knew, my story was over." But when is your story really over? Of course, we all know people die, and their story isn't over, it goes on. So there was lots of resonances then around that. And the thing about the font, I'm not sure, did we try out different things to make it work? And the song thing was to do with, because Perry Como was reportedly a seventh son of a seventh son. And I wasn't a big Perry Como fan before this, just to say, I was more... No, I was more Jim Reeves, or maybe whatever. But anyway, Dean Martin or something. But I became very familiar with Perry Como over the course of writing it. And a good thing about him is he had a hugely long career, and he sang a huge amount of songs. So any song that I wanted to put into it, there was a good chance Perry Como had done a version of it. So it gave me a great breadth of songs to choose from. But yeah. Sorry.
Okay, that's terrific. Thanks for all that, Kathleen. Paul, can I invite you up to read a little bit of Run with the Hare and Hunt with the Hound?
Thank you very much. So, as David said at the top there, the book is set in 12th century Ireland. It's around the kind of Anglo-Norman invasion, so it's something we're very familiar with from school. I'm just going to go into the middle of a piece here where basically the characters are returning from a cattle raid, which we know are very prevalent and very common features of life at that point. That evening, we rode across the Tierna's lands, driving the spoil of cattle in great procession. At the head, the Tierna and his men clung to their mounts, falling drunk and gesturing like returning Caesars, while the people of the farmsteads came out to applaud and hail and sing their joy. I came at the rear, walking behind, forgotten, and trying to keep sight of Ness, where she walked with Moore and the other women around her, trying to gauge her welcome. We turned towards home, and the fierceness of the low sun blinded us from above the woods, adding a final touch of the unreal to the day. Following the long, wakeful hours of the Táin, tiredness threatened to overwhelm me on that last push across the outer meadows, shapes suggesting themselves in the corners of my vision. Word had been sent ahead to the Tierna's house, and billows of smoke and steam rose into the massive arch of the evening sky. The entire farmstead was arrayed there, waiting dutifully, crying out and singing victory. When we arrived at the compound, we could see that a huge feast had been prepared, and a steam laden with the smell of broth and meat and bread escaped through the doorway. The Tierna entered first, and Tour ushered all inside. The house was scarcely able to accommodate us all, and yet the women and the servants poured in, pushing through the crowd, trying to carry in food and ale. A large board had been set out, and the Tierna's benches arrayed around the edges of the house, draped with furs and linens. Feasting began immediately, with the Tierna and his warriors still in their quilted coats. Regardless of the boisterous mood and the drunken state of many of the men, etiquette was observed without deviation as to who sits at the Tierna's right hand, who at his left, who beyond that, and who can eat a morsel before who and drink from which vessel. A fire burned high in the hearth, and those standing by were singed by its flame. The merriment and celebration were widespread, as the tales of the Táin were recounted through mouthfuls of meat. I stood by the door, ravenous and waiting for something to pass my way. The storytelling became increasingly loud, as Irk proved to have the strongest voice, which carried over all and commanded attention. He was recounting how we had gathered the cattle, and I heard my name spoken. Suddenly the Tierna cried out, "Where is my Virgil of the North? Where is that purple Saxon?" And it was clear from his voice that he was very inebriated. Donnacha and even Con cheered in an irresistible upsurge of mirth. They gripped me and propelled me forward along the benches, and among the blur I caught sight of Father's face in the crowd as he laboured to keep the tapers lit, the firewood in, and the ale flowing. His expression a pale gulf within the feverish celebration. A kind of sad pride hung on his face. It seared me, this look, and I can see it still through the veil of years, haunting me with its foreknowledge. He saw the danger that I could not, the danger in the novelty of a lord's regard. I was passed up by the fire, crowded hounds nipping in the chaos, and the blaze of the fire illuminating the press of faces. "A verse from you, boy, a verse." And the hall erupted in the unquenchable turmoil of the drunkard, and they chanted loudly, "A verse, and nothing would do as I stood there terrified and sickened. Ness, sitting by the door with Irk, his lecherous face bent to her ear. And I began to shout out in Latin, the first words that came to mind, and a thick hand from the fireside cuffed me roughly, and a cry went up, "Speak words we can understand, you cur, none of your Sassenach drawl here." And the laughter and turmoil rose beyond what I had ever heard, overtaking my senses, and in the heat and shame, my face boiled red. "Dawn!" I shouted with as much force as I had, and the crowd was quelled into a quieter kind of mirth. over Uraglig's county. Herself knew not of the warriors dark within her wood, untouched by her light like Trojans in their horses. Cheers went up with claps and hearty derision. I pressed on, grabbing words from the air, from I knew not where, until they sprang into battle and slew all who stood between them and glory, back over foreign hills, driving spoil and fame before them. Enough, enough, shouted the Tierna with tears in his eyes as he laughed and coughed and drank and laughed more at my butchery of the metrical precision of their poetry. Tor balked at the sacrilege, the mockery of his craft. His lips pursed and he raised a warning hand as if he would cast a curse. And unchained, I could not hold back, standing high on the bench, emboldened and drenched and permeated with everything that had happened. I shouted with the fullness of my throat, from the bag of my belly, pointing. The poet's look was black, as I, the lowest boy, profaned his age-old cant. In the uproar, a bench tilted over, and laughter split the roof beams, dimmed the fire, filled the dark, and even the olive himself smiled in that brief moment when the fool was king, and I was almost transported on it, carried away to a place where I was not the meanest, the least, the unfree, to a place where I was someone of worth, someone of note, no longer the least speckle on the meanest egg in the smallest wren's nest on the measliest branch of the most beggarly tree, until I saw her again by the door, her eyes dark, her mouth silent, her body hard.
Okay, that's a lovely reading. I was privileged to see some of the evolution of this story through a mentorship scheme, so I'm fairly aware of. It's part of a bigger project all about this historical character, Hugo de Lacy, is that right?
Yeah, so as you said at the start, I would do a lot of archaeology work and history, historical research. And I suppose 20 years ago, now at this stage, when I was a student, I spent a year in France, and I was looking at the medieval history of the Cathar Crusade. And I was just interested in the period, in the sort of architecture and that of the time. But I sort of stumbled across a story that I've been telling ever since, which is that the Earl of Ulster at the time, Hugh de Lacy, was actually involved in the crusade. There's very little, it hadn't been picked up on, I suppose, by historians over here. And it's just a very intriguing story. And it's got all the dramatic elements that you might expect to put into a book like this. But kind of like what Kathleen was saying there, when you're writing a novel or you're basically getting into someone's head, you're spending a lot of time around the characters. And very quickly I realised that I didn't necessarily want to be spending all of my days in the head of narcissistic, overbearing, Norman Noble man who basically, effectively, kind of a Donald Trump character of the time, at the head of a feudal system. So it went a slightly different way. That story is still in the background, David, but it's a much larger story, which hopefully you'll kind of get to.
And I think your choice of the narrator is critical for the working of this book, and it's that classic character that you often get during invasions who has divided loyalties and a number of languages. Like in the invasion of Mexico by the Spanish, Cortez, his concubine was La Malinche, who was an Indian really, but she spoke Spanish as well, so she was able to go between the two. And your character here, Albric, his father had been kidnapped and was now a kind of a slave. So he was raised both with Gaelic, but raised as a serf. But then from his father, he knew the other languages. So he becomes very useful, I suppose, as a device as well as a character.
Yeah, exactly. So it's through the character of Albric, you kind of permitted me to have a look at the I suppose what I'm interested in more than the sort of high end, the battles and the sort of aristocracy. It's as an archaeologist, it's the actual lived reality, you know. And Albrecht lets me explore that, but also he has the foot in both camps. But again, it sort of allows you to stay clear of the nationalist sort of narrative as well, or the sort of nation state thing, because so one of the things we always learn in school about the Anglo-Norman invasion, or one of the things we don't learn, I should say, is that at the time, a lot of the Irish clerics and lords really thought that the coming of the Anglo-Normans into Ireland was a divine retribution for all of the slave raiding that had been going on from Ireland into England. So that doesn't really make the cut in the history syllabus, that we were actually raiding very extensively into England at the time and carrying off people, basically. So it was kind of irresistible, really, thinking about it. What did the invasion look like from one of these people who we know were in Ireland? And that's the thing, you know, initially it's seen as this great potential for deliverance, but then obviously it brings all sorts of complications as well.
And then I suppose one of the questions is, I mean, they always say write about what you know, and you're intimately steeped in this history and the sort of the setup, the loyalties, the caste system, the utensils they'd use. How easy is it to create a picture for Joe Public who wouldn't be as aware of that? How difficult did you find that to do? Like, for example, what Dublin looked like in the 12th century or things like that?
I found it very natural. So it was it was a real flow, because I suppose I spent a lot of time trying to communicate that to people through archaeological talks, or you know, bringing people around an archaeological site where you're looking at holes in the ground or bits of stone and trying to evoke a picture for them. So this was really like taking the brakes off in that regard, because I didn't have to couch everything in, oh, well, this could have been like this, and we think from previous, you know, the caution didn't have to be there. And that actually allowed, it was like taking the brakes off. It was very freeing. But at the same time, every time that Albrecht walked into a room or was in this particular situation, you know, made very sure that every single thing that he sees or encounters it's on the money in terms of what can be attested to historically or through archaeology. And that was a learning experience as well for myself. So, yeah.
Yeah, it does come across when you're reading this book. I always say, I do a lot of creative writing teaching, that it's lovely when an author is an authority as well. I mean, the words are etymologically related, and it comes across that you are both author and authority on what you're talking about, I suppose. Speaking of which, Angela, would you like to read us a little bit from The Amusements, please?
I thought the Normans were at the door there for a minute, a bit worried. So my debut novel, The Amusements, is set in Tramore in County Waterford, and it's the story of two teenage friends who want to break free, like a lot of us do when we're teenagers, and get out of the place that we come from. But it's told not just from their points of view, but from the point of view of the entire community in Tramore, an imagined community. So I'm going to read to you from the beginning. Can you all hear me? Because I have a bit of a sore throat, so I'm going to kind of probably shout so I can be heard. So, Tramore, population 6,101. It was the off-season and the local youngsters were up to no good in Tip Phelan's caravan park. He wasn't about to begrudge them a few flagons in the dunes until he got a phone call from the Garda Sergeant telling him a bad element was hanging around. Would you consider installing security cameras or a couple of Alsatians? That was the way with the guards. They'd make a suggestion, and if you ignored it, you'd be done for tax or speeding or any old shite. The call would have to be acted on, but you were only courting trouble with dogs and cameras, so Tip put a small ad in the Irish Independent instead. Wanted, caretaker to live rent-free by the sea. He was known as Tipperary because the only song he ever sang was Sliabh na Mán. In the back room of the Grand on a Saturday night, nobody would deny he had a voice, There was a want in it that could be only understood by men, since it afflicted them alone. An unassailable scourge for which there was no end or cure. Whenever he cleared his throat to sing, a shut-up-to-fuck swept over the bar, hush, 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 all the way down to the lounge. Tip closed his eyes tight against the silence and began. Alone, all alone by the wave-washed strand, and alone in a crowded hall. The hall it is gay, and the waves they are grand, but my heart is not here at all. His real name was Michael Phelan, but nobody in Tramore, apart from his wife Verona, knew it. She called him Tip anyway, and he called her V or VP when they were alone, and she gave him the look, knowing it would drive him demented. They could be at it half the night, and often they were. The next day, he'd be addled with desire and a profound ache in his bones. Early on in the marriage, when he was still hurling, he'd sleep out of temptation's way in the spare room, a measure he was forced to take after a bionic all-nighter left him in ribbons for the county final. The sentiment on the sideline was that he'd been brutal, and they took him off at half-time. But the match was beyond salvation. Oh, V was lethal, all right, or at least she had been before the twins came along. These days, she was indifferent to him. It was like living with a cat. When she wasn't changing the babies, she was nursing them, one on each nipple, their little fat legs kneading her stomach like it was dough. She was exhausted, destroyed. He begged her to patch things up with her mother, for the love of God. Verona bundled her breasts back into the sling she'd taken to wearing in place of a bra and zipped her fleece up to the chin. Hell will freeze over, she said, before I talk to that bitch again. 22 people applied for the caretaker job. Tip ruled out 17 immediately on the grounds of age, criminality and Englishness. Of the 5 that remained, 4 hung up when they heard the position was unpaid. The 5th was a musician from Dublin. His accent was thicker than tar. Could do with the headspace. The payphone swallowed another 20 pence on him. Do you know what I mean? Tip knew exactly what he meant. The place is yours, he said. The musician arrived at the weekend with a hold all over his shoulder and a guitar case in one hand. The other one he extended in a handshake that was too solid to be sincere, his dark eyes holding Tip's gaze for longer than was necessary. Duffy was his name, and he was idling around the 30 mark, with matted brown hair and the makings of a ginger beard. He wore a hoop in one ear and a scrap of black silk knotted around his throat, an affectation that left itself dangerously open to interpretation. But he had the strut of a man who wouldn't take any lip. They agreed if there was trouble, he was to phone Tip, and if there wasn't, he was to leave him alone.
That's great. Thank you very much, Angela. Once again, disclosure, I am aware of how this novel evolved over a few years. The same question I put to Kathleen. Did this begin in terms of short stories, or did it begin with a novel in mind, or how did it come about?
I wrote a short story that was about a little girl in Tramore, and it won the Harper's Bazaar competition. I was actually writing a different novel. I'd gotten into the novel fair in the Irish Writers' Centre with a different novel, and I was doing the MFA in UCD at the time, but I was stuck on that novel. And this short story, when it won the prize, I couldn't get it out of my head, you know, and I was like, well, people seem to really like this Tramore business. So I just started writing around that character and developed Helen Grant, was her name, just developed her more as a character. And suddenly her life just became really populated, and the town became populated, and she had a friend, and, you know, in the town there was the circus, the butcher, the, you know, I mean, like Bray, very much like, you know, when you have seaside towns, there's a very particular atmosphere in them. And I was very curious. I know Tramore quite well, and I'm sure people who live in Bray have this experience as well, of when people go away after the summer, you kind of can almost look at the rigging behind the whole show that's put on for the tourists and the day trippers. And I was like, well, who are the people behind this? And that was really what drove me to it. I wanted to kind of explore that idea of the seaside town, particularly out of season. So.
Yeah, and I know that the working title for a long time was Postcards from Tramore. Oh, sorry, Greetings from Tramore. Postcards from Tramore was the project that your man had, was it? Yeah, sure. Okay, so then you had this character, Helen Grant, and her friend Stella Swain in school with friends. One stays, one goes away, and you sort of got a framework of a story there. I'm very interested in how the novel is then constructed, because I know we're both very fond of Elizabeth Strout as a writer, and it's something she does. It's almost like a whole series of interconnected short stories come together to form a mosaic. Was that very much what you wanted to do, or is that how it organically developed? Or, I mean, there are different voices, different points of view in each chapter, which is interesting.
It came around that way just by itself, but I'm a huge fan of Elizabeth Strout, but I realised that actually the composite novel, that in Europe we don't have as much regard for it as they would in the US. So say something like, Winesburg, Ohio, or something like Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad. These were all huge influences on me. And actually, Maeve Binchy wrote an awful lot of her novels in composite form as well. That if you look at them, and Donal Ryan does it, The Green Road by Anne Enright, but we just don't see it as that. As a novel, or sorry, my book, people are more likely to look at it and kind of think, well, they're short stories that are interconnected, but they don't actually stand on their own 2 feet as short stories. They'd be very poor short stories, and I was quite concerned that by the end, that the main characters, that there would be a resolution, and so it was a tapestry that I had to, it was an awful lot more work than I thought it was going to be. It really was like knitting an iron jumper and dropping a stitch down at the hem and having to go back down and sort of bring it the whole way up. I nearly lost my mind at some stages, so it was supposed to, from the very beginning, once I realised that it was a portrait, I knew that it wasn't going to be a collection of short stories, no.
It's always one of those questions that comes up a lot in terms of all these composite novels. What are they? And the cynic in me, if there is one, says publishers want them to be novels so they can be entered into novel competitions. And it can be a marketing thing of where they show up in shops. That said, Olive Kitteridge, anything is possible, all those, they are. To the extent that it's a useful distinction, they really are novels, which is kind of interesting. Okay, I'm wondering then, if memory serves, an agent got in touch with you and there was a lot of backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. How was that process for you?
It was a great relief, David. Yeah, it was. God, I signed with an agent on my 50th birthday. At the beginning of lockdown, and I thought, Jesus, I'm actually giving up my job to write this novel. There's a pandemic, and I've got a massive credit union loan to pay for my MFA. It is a midlife crisis. I've gone mad. So it was amazing to get this phone call. And what happened was I'd entered the Deborah Rogers Foundation, kind of a competition in the UK, and I wasn't shortlisted. I wasn't longlisted. But one of the judges pulled my submission out of the slush pile, and she was an agent with RCW, and rang me and said, "Have you got a full manuscript?" And I said, "Yeah." And she, within 48 hours, she signed me. It was amazing. The whole week I was thinking, because there was a bit of champagne going on, I was thinking, should I imagine this actually happening? Now, then she had to sell it, and that was where the question of the composite novel kind of came into play. But I was delighted when she did. She found a home for it in Penguin, Ireland, in Penguin Sandy Cove, which for me was just absolutely the best possible outcome, because my editor was in Dublin, and, it's obviously a brilliant publisher. So it's all been a bit, really a dream. Yeah, you feel really fortunate. But it did take several years. It took the whole of lockdown, which was probably a very good way to spend lockdown, waiting for the book to come out.
Okay, and that kind of segues neatly into the next series of questions for the group here. I'm assuming that the audience are interested in how does one move from debut manuscript to debut novel or debut publication. Kathleen, you also have an agent, isn't that right? How did that come about, and then how important was that for a debut novel to come out, having an agent in place?
Thanks. I was writing short stories, and I had sent some short stories out to a few agents, and they weren't interested in representing a collection. And I had a name of another agent, and I said in that email, different to the previous ones, here's blah, 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 and I'm also working on a novel. Not true, not a good idea, not the way to go with this. And she got back immediately and said, I'm not sure about the stories, but I'd love to see the novel. So then I had to fess up and say, when I say a novel, what I mean is I have some work here that I feel could be a novel. And I spent a few weeks and I got it up to about maybe 10,000 words, what had been a short story and some other material that I felt. So I kind of pushed it forward, which is kind of what you have to do anyway. So it was the same process, just probably at an earlier stage. So I met her that summer and she said, look, I really like the voice, and if you feel you can carry this through to a novel, she signed me up then and said, look, I'll represent it then if it gets to that place. So I don't know how important all of it is because I've only done this once. So if I did this like 5-6 times, I could say, well, that was important, that wasn't, but I've only got one experience. But where it was positive was, I guess, at a certain point in time, if people are writing a novel, their head goes to, how will I get this published? And my head didn't go there when I was writing it, because I thought, well, if I can do my bit of the deal, she's already agreed to take it at least and read it and maybe represent it. So I didn't spend any time thinking about that during the process of writing that. So I guess that was probably helpful, because I didn't have to think about that. I just had to think about doing my bit of it, which is the writing bit. And then we had quite a bit of back and forth with the manuscript. There was 3 back and forths in terms of giving her manuscript, and she was saying, yeah, I like it, but I'm not sure I get this back. I still have some problems. And then the 3rd time she was like, okay, I get this. I'll go out with this. So that was the process.
And she's now going to do your short story collection as well?
Yeah, I'm not sure if she's keen about that, but she's going to do it. Yeah. I don't know. Like, I don't really know the business well enough to know, is that a hard thing for her to do or not? But I had said to her at the start, I've had a few short stories published here and there, and I'd like to put them together as a collection. And I met her just there. I just met her there at the end of the summer again. She was in town, and I said to her, look, I'm still interested in doing this. And she's good. Like, she's positive or neutral. She tries not to be negative about things, I presume that's part of her job. So she's interested in maybe another novel, and I'd like to work on another novel. That would be interesting to do. But sometimes I say ideas to her, and she's like, I had an idea, and I said it to her at the very start when we had got the manuscript together. She said, you need to think about the next thing. And I said, well, I have this thing I've been working on for a few years, and it's 4 scissors, and they're in a museum, and they're talking to each other, and they're telling each other stories about, one is a hair-cutting scissors, and she just kind of sits there and just lets me wind myself out. And then she's like, So I said to her about the scissors again this year, and she's like, yeah, okay, well, look, work on the short stories, and then we'll see, what goes on. So I think that's positive. Yeah, it's not negative.
Well, her job is to cut, isn't it? Sorry. I suppose if you don't have an agent, you're in the situation of Donal Ryan, whose manuscript was turned down 46 times before it was finally taken on, and that was by an intern, really. Or myself, I didn't work with an agent. I believe you didn't as well. So was it a hard sell, Paul, to try to find a publisher?
Yes, it was actually. It took a good long while of reaching out, the cover letter, drafting and redrafting. I was actually contacted by an agent a few years ago. I had a piece, story in the Irish Times, and they were asking, did I have a manuscript, same kind of thing. I tried, the thought crossed my mind to kind of blag it and wing it for her. But no, I just said no. I said, if you have one come back. Now, the piece in the Irish Times was contemporary fiction. It was nothing to do with historical fiction at all. And I did send on the manuscript then, but it just wasn't, I suppose, what she was looking for. So that's fine. But it was an uphill struggle. So it's crafting the query letters, trying to, I suppose, create the CV. And then the sell, I don't know, it's very hard to see behind the veil. What's the reaction when this lands on somebody's desk? Is it automatic slush pile? Or I suppose I was trying to play the angle of, like you said, somebody with expertise writing about a period. Did that all seem a bit stodgy and a little bit too, academic or something? Or I then started to sort of wonder, is the medieval fiction viewed as quite genre? Is that the sort of knee-jerk reaction? Medieval fiction is genre fiction. It's kind of more pulp end of things. It's not for us. So, yeah, it was a good year sending out, and I'd have to tally it up now. I wonder what was Don Ryan, 40? Might be in around that, yeah, ballpark. But I just got wind of a press then in the States who were focused on putting out historical fiction, but also history, and interested in telling stories through historical fiction. And it was probably nearly 18 months ago when they asked for the full manuscript after having seen a sample of it, and then they were sitting on that for maybe, reading for maybe a month, and then they came back and made an offer. So it's a different situation. The book is about to come out formally in the next couple of weeks. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Sure.
It's a little bit more complicated this side of the water, but
yeah,
we'll see.
You have to learn to push yourself. It's coming out next Thursday, folks, in Marion Square, Southside. I'll have the honour of launching it, so please do join us for the formal launch of Paul Duffy's book. And Kathleen was saying what she hopes will come out next is the short stories. Are you working on the sequel of this, or what are you doing at the moment?
Yeah, look, I had great intentions of having this. I suppose that the good thing about working on this historical narrative is it's all laid out there. You just have to get through it. Well, obviously the broader arc, let's say. So that's the fun, is finding your way in and around the situations and seeing where it takes you. Not as far advanced as I would like to be. A lot of day job stuff getting in the way. But obviously I'm dreaming of huge sales that will allow me to drive off into the sunset with a typewriter in the boot and just get the second one done.
Yeah, doing an Angela Flannery and just giving up your day job. Angela, same question for you. What are you working on now, and where might it take you?
Well, I'm just going to stand in a soapbox in defence of the short story after what Kathleen has said. So I'm always working on short stories. I am working on my second novel, but I am doing the publicity for the amusements and talking about Stella and talking about Helen and all the characters really took me out of my second novel. So over the summer, while I was doing that, I wrote a couple of short stories. Lucky enough to get one of them shortlisted for the Francis McManus this year, which was brilliant. But I have a couple of other ones on the go as well. It amazes me. Like, I was stunned at the novel fair when I tried to kind of, really interest the publishers and agents by going, and I also write short stories. They nearly all got up from the desk and walked away. Like, they just don't want to know. No, they're so not commercial, and it horrifies me because I'm so influenced and such a huge admirer of Irish short story writers. I mean, Frank O'Connor, William Trevor, Kevin Barry. We've got, you look through the New Yorker archives, we're the best short story writers in the world, and we have no regard for the thing that we do best. It just horrifies me. Anyway, I'm also working on a novel, if anyone asks you. But yeah, I'm working on a novel. It's not set in Tramore, it's set in New York, Dublin, and Mullingar. So.
I will point out that I'll be interviewing Claire Keegan on Sunday, and it's a sellout. There's 240 people in the audience. It's sold out. So she's basically, there's one ever so slightly, is it a novel, is it a short story? But the rest are still short stories, aren't they, that she's written. So the interest is there. The public will come. It's the publishers is the problem, I think. We have about 5 minutes for questions for the public, if anyone would like to ask any of these people about anything, really. Yep, sure.
You said that Paul has a launch next Thursday. Can you be more specific?
Paul, can we be more specific?
Yeah, so it's a launch of sorts. It'll be after Adele Brannock's lecture in NUI Marion Square, which is on the conversion of the Dublin Vikings to Christianity, and there'll be a launch after that then. So it's a talk from 6 to 7, run through Dublin Festival of History, and then the launch after that from 7 onwards.
Yeah, I actually signed up for that, but only virtually, so I won't be there. Can we get copies of the book after that somehow?
have a few copies here today. Thank you very much. That was nearly like it was a plant. Thanks for that. Yeah, I have some copies here today if anybody's interested, and then Kenny's are stocking it as well, and it should be appearing then at bookshops from the next fortnight.
That's not Paul's mother in the audience, by the way. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. You are Paul's mother. Would you like to say anything else about him? No? Any other questions from the audience?
Can I just ask, how much editing did you do? I know that's a bad word, but did you spend a lot of time self-editing, or did you give it out to somebody else to do?
Is that for the three or for anyone in particular?
Anybody?
Anybody. How much editing goes on between manuscript being accepted, shall we say, and then final thing coming out? Would you like to tell us about the original title and why it wasn't chosen, Angela?
Well, I'll tell you what the original title was, Greetings from Tremor, but by the time that it went to acquisition meetings with publishers, somebody said, Tremore sounds very Italian. And they thought, no, you need to change the name of this. I think The Amusements was a better title anyway. No, but to answer your question, an awful lot. I mean, I'm at the moment, like the paperback, this isn't technically a paperback, is coming out in a couple of months, and they gave it back to me to say, are there any kind of nips and tucks? I mean, I'd like to rewrite the whole thing, you know, and that's just, I think, naturally, I mean, not that I think there's anything wrong with it, it's a great book, buy it, but, no, it's just that you'd love to kind of tear it asunder and see, could you make it better? But I would never, I did a lot of editing, but most of it was line editing. I didn't have to do a structural edit, which is, I had the kind of fear that, yeah, the fear that that would happen and that the whole thing would fall apart and I'd have to start, you know, sort of reassembling it like a giant book made out of 10 billion pieces of Lego and with no plan, you know. So, but yeah, the editing, you just keep going and going and going.
Yes. You keep going and going. Yeah, I agree. I mean, now I have to say, you, in terms of your question, you presented kind of editing maybe in a negative way. I really enjoy it because at a certain point, like there's a lot of pushing and shoving to kind of keep pushing forward with a novel. You have to push when there's no momentum, and at a certain point, it develops momentum. The work develops momentum, and it carries you through. It should carry through. I mean, if there's energy in it, it should carry through an end. And then when you go back to edit, at least you have something. It's like working on stone. You have a shape, and it's up to you then some of the contours or some of the finer work. So it's like a Sudoku puzzle. You just go back over and back over, and I find it quite satisfying because it's improvements, and the fact that you've done something, and there's always an extra, like Angela said, I bet anybody would take their book and go back over it and change it. But there is something very satisfying of having an opportunity. Like so much stuff in the world now is so quick, like maybe social media is so quick and so reactive. So to be able to work in a way where you're writing in a non-reactive way, that you can take time and think, well, hang on a minute. But if he knew him and he's his uncle, well, surely he would have known his father a lot better than that. I've got to go back in there and I've got to really think about how he would have known him as a small child as well as a teenager. So there's a different emotional relationship. And once you go back and you kind of things surface and you do that, and then it has other... Now, it's not always pleasant because you change one thing and there's all these implications for everything else. But that's the work. It's just a piece of work. And if you are up for doing the work, it's very... I think it's quite satisfying work. So I think editing is... it's not quite the thrill of the newness, but there's something very satisfying about the work bit of it, for me anyway. So, but I have to do a huge amount of editing. I don't write anything first draft that's anyway acceptable in primary school level English. So, a lot of editing for me. Paul, editing?
As I said already, so I had about a year of sending the manuscript out. So there was a couple of times, yeah. Well, I suppose it was working and refining it the whole time. But yeah, to make it a bit more of an immediate narrative, introduced an extra chapter at the outset, which I think worked very well in the end. And then the other thing was I was getting a lot of, when I did get criticism or feedback from with refusals from publishers, there was a lot made of the Irish names. So I was trying to use kind of historically accurate names and spellings, which, to be fair, probably look about that long on the page. So, yeah, I had to now, obviously still keeping the sense of the time, trying to choose names that were a bit shorter. So that was a major thing. And then when it came to the actual publisher, there wasn't a huge amount to be done beyond the line editing, so it was good.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Paul's book is available here to buy in advance of the launch next week. Kathleen and Aingeala's books are available down in Dubray, but unfortunately we don't have copies here. It's one of those things. So can we have a warm round of applause for our three dazzling debuts?